Hi, and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video, I'm going to try to answer the question, who must comply? When we talk about compliance, who's the subject? Is it everyone? Is it only companies, private entities, public companies? Well, what are we talking about? Let's look at it. So before we can look on the dynamic compliance side, we need to look back a bit because most literature focus on companies being the subject of compliance. So it will focus on how companies act, how they behave in terms of social responsibility and so on. Of course, this would be the first to go kind of solution because companies have a lot of regulation that they need to comply with. So if we think about the reactive compliance, the old school type of compliance where you have a lot of legislation, regulation, requirements that you have to comply with, well, we wouldn't necessarily look at the public sector because we would primarily look at the subjects of the regulation, which typically would be the private sector, hence companies. So that might be one reason. On the other hand, they have to, on top of that argument, they have to strategize and plan their whole behavior and do it in alignment with their stakeholders. So they have to act and behave according to their stakeholders. You cannot just change the whole company or vote differently at a new election. So there's a larger expectation from society, which also goes to the last point saying, well, they do have a large impact on society. So of course there are expectations, which is also why the scandals arise typically around companies and not so much member state, because at some sense people often just accept that they can just vote differently next time in a democratic process. One last thing is the acknowledgement of risk. Companies do always acknowledge that there are risk of contracts, there's risk everywhere in the world. So by that, they have to accept risks, they have to argue why they take certain risk, and that also makes them more vulnerable of failure or maybe overseeing some risk areas. So this is what literature and what we have primarily focused on. But are companies the only one who has to be compliant? Well, not really. If we look at the AML regime in Europe, also above Europe, we can see that the risk-based regulation starts at the UN level in terms of the AML regulation. Because the FATF puts out guidelines. These guidelines and evaluations affect the regulatory framework and the risk parameters and how even compliance officers in a bank, employees, have to act because they need to assess the risk pictures that the UN by FATF has lined out and the EU. And in this case, I just put in the Danish flag because I'm Danish, but the member state within the EU. And then, of course, we have the entity, the bank, and then the client in the end. So, in fact, when we talk about compliance, there are so many actors. We cannot just limit it to being the company, because if a member state doesn't have good supervision of the companies might fail. Plus, the member state needs to focus also by police enforcement, investigations, have go to court, to represent the legal framework. If they don't do this on a risk-based approach and do it effectively, the whole system will fail, because if only the entities, the companies, if they learn to comply with risk-based regulation, well, who is to enforce the risk-based regulation? If the member state doesn't know how it is. or doesn't have it founded in the way that the public authorities should act. You need to be able to see that this risk-based approach has to go through every single element and every single level. So therefore, let's try to start at the top of this kind of ladder within the AML regime. We have UN as a supranational collaboration. The UN has core principles. We know them from the UN Global Compact, where they have these 10 goals. So the thing about UN is you're not forced to enter. In that sense, you don't have the same enforcement mechanism as you do at a lower legal level at the EU. But they do have what I call, just to try to reflect on this as a corporation. So they do have a product line because they have signatories. So everyone who signed up for a convention, well, they are in fact the product that is their clients or something in that line that they need to secure that these signatories, countries, actually comply with the core values that they represent. Such values could be human rights, anti-corruption, environmental protection, no child labor, no discrimination, etc. So even though you might consider UN to be this big political agenda, they do have to comply also with their own principles. And they need to secure that their signatories, or the countries or unions that can also be a signatory, that they also comply. So there is a process here where you cannot just limit it to the company. Even the UN has to acknowledge that they need to comply and they need to be in compliance with their own core values, and they need to seek it through the system to try to optimize that everyone is doing what they're supposed to do. In that, we can take the next level. Of course, the EU also has to comply. If we see the UN is kind of the above policy system, then you have the EU underneath. So whenever EU is represented as a signatory at the UN level, typically the EU will implement the guidelines and the policies through EU regulation. But the EU itself also have a founding treaty with core values as equality, legitimacy, proportionality, and effectiveness. And these principles must be aligned upwards against the UN, so they cannot just sign a convention that would not comply with these principles, because this is the constitutional foundation. It's the core principles, the treaty of the European Union. At the same time, the EU has enforcement power by the court system. So they also have to enforce. If they don't do it at all, if there's no enforcement mechanism, then how would you consider compliance? How do you keep your member state in compliance with these core principles? You cannot, because, well, you can try to, but it's really hard when you don't have enforcement mechanisms. We can see that when we're dealing with the climate crisis right now. So EU also has to acknowledge that they need to be compliant. They need to secure compliance upwards and down in all collaborations they enter. Next level, member states. This is not something that we often talk about, that our member state, our country, where we origin from, that they have to think about compliance, but they do. I've been talking with so many people working in the public sector, even within the operational, within the state, even people who have to govern EU legislation, just where they have put it into Danish legislation, of course, and try to enforce it, but they don't understand the risk-based concept. If our authorities do not understand their own obligations, they could risk enforcement mechanisms from the EU level. So every member state, every authority need to consider themselves as a subject of compliance. They need to secure that they comply with, of course, the rules within the member state, the constitutions. We have general rules that we need to comply with, but also the EU law at the same time. Sometimes, of course, when it comes to more policy-driven areas of regulation and behavior, the question of sovereignty can be affected, but no matter what, the member state need to see this, that they need to comply, and they also need to take it a down step, or the next step in their compliance structure. They need to address that even though they're really good at putting out regulation, they themselves need to assess their own regulation and secure that their operational system in the authority, supervision, etc., fining, is in accordance with EU law, member states' own principles, to make the most effective regulation on a risk-based approach, for example, given the companies in the country or consumers. Next, the companies. I already addressed some of the issues with companies, but I just put out some examples here because when I say companies, it can be entities, private entities, public entities. It's everyone need to comply. There might be different levels. I've talked about it before. There might be compliance to norms. Some have larger compliance to regulatory requirements, and some have more technical issues or other parts that they need to comply with more than the other parts. That is a totally different assessment, but everyone needs to consider themselves a part of the compliance program. They need to say, okay, I'm a subject in terms of compliance. I need to assess how I'm complying with stakeholders, regulatory requirements, society, norm-giving factors, but also what is running in the world, where do we see tendencies, and especially tendencies because they typically come from below, they come from the consumers. We need to keep an eye on that, and companies need to do that too, because that is where the movement comes from. We can see that because the last couple of years we have seen a vast movement towards climate change, not towards climate change, but in doing the right thing in terms of environmental protection. And that whole force has come from the consumers. It's come from the public who finally demands it of corporation, member states, EU, UN, that actions need to be made. So compliance goes both ways because every consumer essentially is also a subject when it comes to compliance. Because when you go out shopping, you can decide what to buy, or if you even need to buy something. You can decide if you want to take the train, if you want to take the bus, or if you want to take the car somewhere, or even fly. So your compliance, your behavior it's all part of your self-compliance. So when we think about compliance, it's a new age. Dynamic compliance will address everyone within the risk-based regulation, of course, but also just we have to acknowledge that this is a terminology that creates and is about balancing your aim with your actions, no matter if you're a person, a company, member state, union, or even an international collaboration. So everyone is actually a subject to compliance, and we need to address that. That was kind of it for this. The next thing is that we need to look at the scope of compliance. Because if everyone is a part of the compliance umbrella, persons, units, entities, unions, everything. Well, how far should we go talking about compliance? And that is a relevant question, but that will be the topic of the next video. So stay tuned, follow this channel, and let's talk more compliance.